Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today we meet to consider H.R. 2262, the Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act of 2015, H.R. 1508, the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act of 2015, H.R. 2261, the Commercial Remote Sensing Act of 2015, and H.R. 2263, the Office of Space Commerce Act. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2262, the Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act of 2015, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2262, a bill to facilitate a pro-growth environment for the developing commercial space industry by encouraging private sector investment.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking minority member. Thanks, first of all, go to Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy for sponsoring this important legislation. The Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act of 2015, or SPACE Act, facilitates a pro-growth environment for the developing commercial space sector. It creates more stable regulatory conditions and improves safety, which in turn attracts private investment. The Act secures American leadership in space and fosters the development of advanced space technologies. The Space Act preserves the Federal Aviation Administration's ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight in order to protect national security, public health and safety of property. And the Act preserves FAA's ability to regulate spaceflight participation and crew safety in the event of an accident. This bill calls for a progress report on the knowledge the industry and FAA have gained about the operation and licensing of commercial human spaceflight. This allows industry to develop consensus standards and coordinate those efforts with the FAA so the industry can grow in a stable regulatory environment without the threat of arbitrary regulations impacting their ability to innovate. International law places liability for damages that result from space accidents on the launching nation. All spacefaring nations require some form of third-party liability insurance for launching entities. The current U.S. risk-sharing structure expires in 2016. This Act extends indemnification to the year 2023 and requires an update on how the FAA calculates the maximum probable loss associated with launches. Indemnification has never been utilized and is subject to future appropriations. This provision will prevent U.S. space companies from going overseas where other nations have more favorable liability protection. The Space Act also closes a statutory loophole that negates an experimental permit once a launch license is issued for the same vehicle design. This fosters greater innovation and allows an experimental permit holder to continue testing while a license holder conducts operations. Current law only allows for two categories of individuals carried within a spacecraft, crew and spaceflight participants. Now that NASA is procuring astronaut access to the International Space Station, a new category is necessary to outline the roles, responsibilities, and protections for astronauts on a commercial human spaceflight launch. This bill also closes a loophole that carved out an exception for spaceflight participants from indemnification coverage. By including these individuals in the indemnification provision, spaceflight participants who may participate in a launch as a result of a contest or other means are not burdened with financial exposure above the limits. The Launch Liability Convention, to which the U.S. is a party, places liability for space launch and reentry accidents on the federal government. This bill ensures that federal courts review lawsuits that result from accidents, since the federal government is ultimately the responsible party, not the states. Current law requires that all parties involved in a launch waive claims against each other. This bill adds spaceflight participants in the cross-waiver requirement to ensure consistency and reinforce the informed consent requirements. I would like to enter into the record now a list of statements of support from various space community stakeholders, including Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Mojave Air and Spaceport, SpaceX, the National Space Society, and the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, which represents more than 50 commercial space companies across the United States. Did I get all those? Okay. Let me say that we are It's our impression that every single space company has endorsed this bill and not a single one is opposing it. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill that will keep America at the forefront of aerospace technology, promote American jobs, reduce red tape, promote safety, and inspire the next generation of explorers and encourage students to study STEM fields. And that concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we are marking up 4 commercial space-related bills, and I would like to have been able to say that all of these are bills that should pass out of committee with strong bipartisan support. Unfortunately, that will probably not be the case today, and that certainly holds true for the first bill, being considered the Space Act of 2015. This bill amends the Commercial Space Launch Act, which is one of the seminal achievements of this committee. That act opened the doors to establishment of the now flourishing commercial space industry. I think members on both sides of the aisle strongly support this industry in general, and under better circumstances, I would have liked to support the updating of the Commercial Space Launch Act. Unfortunately, I have to oppose the majority's bill as it is currently written. The issues being dealt with in this bill are not straightforward. They are complex and require thoughtful consideration, and this committee hasn't made any attempt to thoughtfully consider the issues being debated today. We haven't had a single hearing on this legislation in the 104th Congress. In fact, we haven't had a hearing on any of the issues in the bill before us in over a year. We also haven't had a subcommittee markup to try to work through some of the underlying issues in this legislation. To echo something Ms. Edwards said at the NASA markup, I don't understand the point of having subcommittees if this is how we're going to proceed. Commercial space is the only regulatory program within the Science Committee's jurisdiction, and yet it apparently doesn't even warrant a hearing. I would note that we found plenty of time to have hearings on fracking and ozone regulations, issues which really aren't terribly relevant to this committee's jurisdiction. It would be nice if we could spend a little more time focused on carrying out oversight within our jurisdiction, and a little less time trying to constantly score political points against the Obama administration. So where did the bill before us today come from? Straight from the industry. Nearly every provision in this bill, in every conceivable way, give preference to the priorities of the commercial space launch industry, whether in matters pertaining to safety of the general public or in matters pertaining to the safety of future customers of this very industry. And it does so at the expense of the American taxpayers. I want to be clear that I'm a strong supporter of commercial space launch industry. I want to see this industry continue to grow and be successful. But I don't want that growth to be at the expense of the safety of the public on the grounds of the space flying public. I certainly don't fault the industry for seeking the most advantageous laws they can get. However, when Congress gets those wish lists from industry, we ought to act with little restraint. Instead, the majority acts with a rubber stamp in crafting of this bill. Democratic members have a number of good amendments today, and I hope that as we move through them and debate the merits of the proposals, we can, at the very least, begin to honestly consider the consequences of what we're doing here today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And on the way to yielding to the gentleman from Mississippi, a co-sponsor of this bill, would I ask him to take his time and then yield to me briefly?
Absolutely. I yield as much time as the chairman needs.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. I just want to briefly put into the record several points. The first is that last October, almost 7 months ago, the minority was given a working draft of this piece of legislation. The minority waited 5 months to reply in writing to our rough draft of this legislation. Furthermore, last February we had a hearing on the subject of the commercialization of space, And several weeks ago, far more than the 48 hours required, we gave the minority notice that we would be marking up this bill. So I think we've bent over backwards to try to be transparent and open about this legislation. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank the chairman for taking up this important piece of legislation that, as he mentioned, I'm a co-sponsor along with the chairman and the majority leader, Kevin McCarthy. The committee held numerous hearings on the topic of commercial space and worked extensively with stakeholders in the administration and the industry for over 3 years. This bill is a product of that labor, and it is long overdue. This essential legislation extends the learning period for commercial human spaceflight regulations by 8 years and directs the FAA to work with the industry on standards development in the meantime. It is also important to note that the FAA still can regulate to protect the uninvolved public, national security, foreign policy, or in the event of an accident or unplanned event. This bill also extends indemnification for 8 years. This provision is critical for our industrial base to stay competitive, particularly when other nations offer far more beneficial protections. A long-term solution is needed to provide stability. This bill does just that. This bill also fixes loopholes that were not envisioned in the 2004 Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004. This bill protects government astronauts flying on commercial launches and applies other protections consistently for spaceflight participants. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of this exciting legislation that will propel our aerospace sector to new heights by decreasing red tape and fostering innovation. I ask that members of this committee support this important bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. The first amendment on the roster is to be offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, and he's recognized for that. Oh, did I overlook somebody?
Do you want to be? She wants to.
Okay. The gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just be very brief. I had hoped, too, that we would be able to come to a mutual agreement in a spirit of cooperation on this legislation. And over the last several days, I know, Mr. Chairman, we've exchanged a couple of text messages and emails to try to get to that point. And so what I'd like to say now is that I do hope, and I have several amendments at the desk today, that over this next week, that if it is indeed possible, that we can try to actually talk through some of these issues so that we can strengthen a bill that all of us who want to see a robust commercial industry that is well supported both by the strength of what we put forward here in the Congress and the industry itself, that we're able to come to some agreement on some of those things. And I don't know whether we will be able to or not, Mr. Chairman, but I offer amendments today in the spirit that over the course of this next week, we know a lot of things can happen in a few days before we get to the floor, that we will be able to deal with some of these issues so that we can go together as Democrats and as Republicans really strongly supporting an authorization of the Commercial Space Launch Act. So
Okay.
with that,
if the gentlewoman would yield before
Absolutely.
you yield back. Do I understand you to say that you would not offer your amendments today with the understanding that we would sit down between now and the floor, and if we could make some agreements on some of these issues, they would be a part of a manager's amendment on the House floor?
What I would offer today is to put my amendments forward, and if we don't come to an agreement on them, if I have the agreement of the chairman that to the extent that they are not accepted, that you would accept my amendments on the floor, up or down, then I'd be happy to do that.
I cannot agree to that. If you were to withdraw the amendments now, I'd be happy to talk to you about the subjects. But if we vote them down today, I don't think anybody should get multiple bites of the apple.
Well, it wouldn't be multiple bites. I'd agree to withdraw the amendments. And
Okay, I thought you.
I'd agree to withdraw the amendments, and then if there are areas where we were able to come to agreement, I actually believe that we could come to agreement, Mr. Chairman. I really do.
I think on some of the issues, that's my feeling as well. But so you are not going to offer the amendments today with the understanding that we would meet between now and the floor and continue to discuss.
I'll tell you what. Let me think about that as we proceed.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
I think you will have to think about it fairly quickly because I think your first amendment is the second one up today, maybe.
Okay.
All right. We'll think about, consider that in a minute. Meanwhile, we will go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, for the First Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment would extend both the indemnification regime and
the clerk will read the amendment, please.
Amendment 009 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Knight of California.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered and the gentleman continues to be recognized.
Thank you very much. My amendment would extend both the indemnification regime and the learning period to 2025. The indemnification extension is not a blank check. The FAA will be required to provide updated methodologies and calculations to Congress to ensure the maximum probable loss thresholds are reasonable and sound. The issue of launch indemnification has been extensively studied by this committee, the FAA, and the GAO. The committee held a hearing on the topic in February of 2014, and the GAO issued a report in July of 2012 that was subsequently updated at the request of this committee in February of 2014. This report included dedicated and in-depth reporting on the indemnification regime. In 2004, the Commercial Space Launch Act Amendments Bill, Congress directed FAA to do an exhaustive study on the indemnification regime, which was completed in 2006, 2 years later, by the Aerospace Corporation. This extension will support the commercial space industry and our economy. For the next 10 years, space launch providers will have the stability and assurance to compete in the international market. Likewise, the extension of the learning period is essential to the health of the commercial space industry. This bill, and indeed my amendment, preserves FAA's ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight in order to protect the uninvolved public, national security, public health and safety, safety of property, and foreign policy. It also preserves FAA's existing authorities to regulate spaceflight, participant, and crew safety. The FAA cannot regulate the industry if it does not have sufficient data to build regulations around. My amendment will preserve and extend the FAA's ability to work with the commercial space industry to develop voluntary industry standards or some other safety framework to be implemented prior to the creation of regulations. These are also reports required to update Congress on the development of the industry and the various standards that are being implemented. This bill directs a final independent report to ensure that the industry has matured to the point that it could sustain further government intervention, allowing Congress the option to extend the learning period if necessary. Any regulation that the FAA issued in the near term will be purely speculative and could irrevocably damage the ability of the industry to grow. This bill and my amendment would provide a reasonable glide path for the industry and the FAA to build a stable and sustainable framework together. I authored the bill in California for indemnification. We have moved that forward in a state that has an awful lot of this type of activity, and we have seen an awful lot of growth in California because of this. I ask for your support in this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Knight, and I appreciate your offering this amendment. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm opposed to the gentleman's amendment. We are here today discussing commercial space because this industry has grown so much over the past several years, and we've seen progress on so many levels. The role of Congress is to adapt our laws to the changing nature of industry as we provide smart regulations and helpful guidance. There is no doubt in my mind that industry will grow over the next coming years. However, this amendment would prevent Congress from adjusting laws on liability, indemnification as the industry develops and changes over the next decade. Additionally, this amendment would delay any safety regulations an additional 2 years from what is currently in the bill. We cannot predict the coming technological breakthroughs or innovative ideas that will come from commercial space, but we can and we should put the safety of spaceflight participants as a top priority. Pushing these dates further into the future may make the lives of our partners in the industry easier, but our job here should not be to do what is convenient, but rather what is in the best interest of safety and success of our future spaceflight endeavors. It should also be noted that Senate's draft commercial space bill proposes a reasonable extension of 4 years rather than the 9-year extension in this amendment. Let's not make a bad provision worse. I urge my members to vote against this amendment, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Are there other members who wish to be heard? The gentleman from California, Mr. Taneko, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I also rise in opposition to the amendment because I think it takes those of us on the committee further apart on an agreement, and I'm hoping that the ranking member and the chairman and other members of the committee can come to an agreement in the next 3 days. I too am from Southern California, and we stand to benefit greatly from a bill on commercial space. I agree with associating myself with remarks of others who say that there is wide support for the industry, and I would love to see this bill go to the floor with wide bipartisan support. And I strongly urge you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member to come to an agreement over the next few days.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Appreciate those comments. Are there other members who wish to be heard? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested, and pursuant to committee rules, a recorded vote on the amendment by Mr. Knight will be postponed. We will now consider whether to go to the next amendment, which is an amendment to be offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment 004 to H.R. 2262, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
With that objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and she is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let's see, 22. I want to just make sure I have the right one. This is the learning period amendment. I don't have the number, so.
I have it down as 004, shortens the commercial human spaceflight learning period to 5 years. Is that the amendment?
Right. That's the one we're on, right?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I mean, we've been going back and forth over here trying to figure out what it is that we do, because this amendment was one of those on the list of 9 items that we thought we could have a negotiation on. And as my colleagues know, the Commercial Space Launch Amendments of 1988 established a 3-tier system for allocating risk between the launch provider and the U.S. government. Ideally, I would like this to be part of a package, but it does seem to me as I was sitting here that on the learning period, that's right, yeah. I'm on the wrong one. I'm sorry. I apologize. But ideally, it would have been helpful and would be difficult to negotiate my pulling my amendments away if we're going to proceed with the other side's amendments, because then we'd be dealing with a different bill. And so my original thought is actually a little bit more complicated. If we were just talking about the base bill, then it would be different, a different consideration with respect to pulling any amendments. And so I don't know if the chairman has a quick thought about that. Otherwise, I'll just proceed with offering the amendment.
Okay. If you want to know my candid advice, it would have been to withdraw those amendments, and we would be happy to discuss the subject of those amendments, but that's totally your decision.
Okay. Well, I'll proceed. It does seem to me then it will be impossible for us to have a bipartisan bill even when it comes to the floor, which is quite unfortunate. As part of the requirements for securing an FAA launch license, a launch provider has to obtain third-party liability insurance. I am still on the wrong one. Where's the learning period?
Maybe that's a sign.
No, it's not. Here it is, right here. No, it's a sign that I mixed up my tabs, which is my fault. So I'll just, now that I only have 2 minutes left, Mr. Chairman, this deals with the moratorium on...
We'll start the timer.
Okay. I appreciate that. The moratorium on FAA's authority to regulate the safety of crew and spaceflight participants was actually initially included in the Space Launch Act of 2004 that would allow the commercial space industry the time to acquire experience and data that would inform the development of safety regulations. For this reason, the learning period of time has been referred to as the learning period. It was initially set at 8 years, an arbitrary number. It wasn't related to anything. However, at the end of the initial period, the commercial space industry was not yet providing commercial operations. So in 2012, Congress extended the moratorium for 3 more years as part of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. The end of that learning period was then set at October 2015. October 1st, 2015. We're approaching that now. So I recognize there are a number in the industry who'd like this regulation-free period to be permanent, and there are those in the majority who would also like to see a permanent moratorium on regulations to protect the safety of spaceflight participants and crew. In fact, they see the commercial spaceflight industry, human spaceflight industry, as a fledgling industry that needs room to grow in the absence of regulatory uncertainty and regulatory burdens. On the other hand, FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation argues that 50 years of spaceflight provides ample time on which to start discussing proposed safety regulation, and that the learning period is not needed. Mr. Chairman, I think that we have to be somewhere between those extremes. I know that we've talked about that and balance the needs of the capabilities of the commercial space industry along with the safety of the crew and spaceflight participants. I think that we all actually share those same concerns. A learning period should define what's to be learned and gained. And so while this section of the bill includes sensible requirements for reporting on the progress of the industry in developing voluntary consensus standards, an 8-year learning period applies little pressure on the industry to adopt critical safety requirements with a sense of urgency. Such standards, if they're developed, could potentially enable the industry to self-regulate or to be used to inform the development of safety regulations. This is why my amendment proposes to set the reporting times that would enable FAA to start its rulemaking proposals 5 years after enactment. I would note that the Senate's draft commercial space bill proposes a shorter learning period than this one does. In fact, it's 5 years in length. And that's why I believe that my amendment strikes a reasonable balance between the needs of the commercial space industry to learn from its experiences and of those who will be flying an upcoming licensed spacecraft. I urge members to support this sensible amendment. And again, I would say that this is the kind of thing that actually could have been negotiated. And Mr. Chairman, I think it's actually the kind of thing we could have agreed on, a 5-year learning period. And with that, I yield the balance of my time. And I thank you for enabling me to clear up my own confusion.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, is recognized in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the gentlelady for offering this amendment to extend the regulatory learning period. We agree that the extension of the learning period is essential to the health of the commercial space industry. By offering only a 5-year learning period, this amendment will offer a significant reduction to the regulatory flexibility provided in the underlying bill. While I am sure that the amendment is well intended, it does not provide the right policy environment that emerging commercial space industry needs. The underlying bill provides for assessments from the FAA on the growth of the industry, constructive interactions between industry and the FAA, a glide path to a safety framework that enables, encourages innovations and improvements in safety. These are all tenets of a progressive development structure that infuses lessons learned from the industry with the inherent government function to protect the public. The underlying bill preserves FAA's ability to regulate commercial human spaceflight in order to protect the uninvolved public, national security, public health, and safety, safety of property, and foreign policy. It also preserves FAA's existing authorities to regulate spaceflight participant and crew safety. The amendment before us would strike down any possibility of industry working with the FAA to develop safety standards that will improve the industry as a whole. This amendment will have a chilling effect in the industry by putting these companies in a more cautious posture against an onslaught of government intervention. This is not the right way to support an emerging space economy that encourages innovation. This amendment assumes that the commercial space industry has not placed the highest priority on safety. It is a sad way of looking at the American entrepreneurial spirit, and I reject the possibility that is the case. For these reasons, I cannot support this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last one.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support Ms. Edwards' amendment. As written, the bill effectively blocks FAA from proposing any safety standards for the commercial space industry for more than 8 years. I want to emphasize the word proposing because final regulations based on that scenario would probably not be in place no earlier than 10 years from now due to the time needed for proposed rulemaking process. I know that some in the industry would like this regulation-free, and this regulation-free period to be permanent. And frankly, I don't know of any industries, especially those scrutinized by Congress, who have such a halfway pass. The 5-year learning period established by the amendment makes sense. It makes sense because it gives reasonable time for the industry to come up with voluntary consensus standards which can be used by FAA to establish a safety framework that will protect crew and space flight participants. As noted, the draft Senate bill also proposes a 5-year learning period. I urge members to support this amendment. I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a position here that may or may not be shared by others on the committee. I'm not really sure. But my position is very simple. Any limitation of liability, any indemnification is wrong on several different grounds. First, it's corporate welfare. It is, in essence, an undeserved subsidy to every corporation that seeks to occupy this space in our economy. And it doesn't surprise me that every corporation that would speak out on behalf of this bill would be in favor of it because they all benefit from it, and they all benefit from it for their own selfish interests. Secondly, I think that this type of limitation of liability, this type of indemnification, creates what economists refer to as moral hazard. We invite an accident. We invite a tragedy by limiting liability and by indemnification. We make it more likely to happen. And it's a simple matter of costs and benefits. When you remove from the equation the cost of an accident or even limit the liability as a result of an accident, what you do is you remove the incentive from these corporations in order to be able to avoid an accident. So I regard this as pernicious, and in particular I regard the potential effect that there might be on innocent victims if there is such an accident. Obviously the regulations that are being contemplated here are regulations that would be safety regulations. They would require these companies that are conducting launches to be companies that have to err on the side of caution. Not having such regulations necessarily means that they don't have either a rule or an incentive to err on the side of caution. We're simply expecting that they will exercise their goodwill when in fact their goodwill is in direct conflict with their bottom line. So because of this corporate subsidy that we're contemplating here, because the absence of regulation necessarily means an inherent danger and risk. And finally, because the victims here will have no recourse under our law. We're talking about people who may be killed, people who may be maimed, people who might be injured for life.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I apologize because I think that I've created like an ongoing confusion here because I started out with indemnification when I was supposed to be on the learning period, and so I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and what we're going to do is attribute them to the indemnification that's going to come up in the next amendment, but totally my fault because I started us off on the wrong track.
I just assumed that he was addressing the next two amendments and was giving him that benefit of the doubt. So Thank you, Ms. Edwards.
I accept what you both are saying. See, we can all be one happy family after all. But just to finish my thoughts here, again, to reiterate, first, it's an undeserved corporate subsidy. Second, it invites dangerous activity on the part of these corporations, whether we're talking about an absence of regulation or we're talking about a limitation of liability or indemnification. And it is true, Chairman Smith, I'm addressing both the amendments in that regard. And third, because we offer no recourse to innocent victims who may be, in fact, the ultimate victims of such activity, I'm against anything that resembles any sort of limitation of liability, anything that resembles any prevention or suspension of the regulatory function to make sure that these activities are done safely. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. On which subject does the gentleman from Colorado want to speak?
On the time period, but also on the indemnification piece, because I think they have...
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And a reason I think they both they fit together here is Mr. Knight makes very good points about the need for the industry to develop itself, have this learning period. He has passed his amendment to extend it to 9 years or 10 years or whatever it was. But what you have two different things. You have this learning period, and at the same, you have indemnifications. You have a learning period without much regulation, and you have indemnification. And so those two things end up working at cross purposes, if you will, because the indemnification component of this does what Mr. Grayson would say, which is, well, you know, nobody really has to watch out for what they're doing because they're indemnified. Now we've extended the period of time in which they're indemnified to have this learning period, so they don't really have the incentive to police themselves, and they don't have regulation at the same time. And so it really puts both amendments or the whole bill sort of at cross purposes with itself. I would urge the passage of Ms. Edwards' amendment because it has a more finite time where you have the learning period and you have indemnification. And you do it for a shorter period of time than having a long learning period without regulation and have indemnification at the same time, which then stops the industry from policing itself. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. The question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is also, no, it goes to Mr. Grayson if he wants to. Oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm confused. Yeah, it goes to Ms. Edwards. The gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized for her next amendment.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment 003 to H.R. 2262, offered by Ms. Edwards
Without
of
objection, the
Maryland.
amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I have to tell you, I do believe in divine intervention, and so I think there is something that is going on here that's telling us that we need to go back to the drawing board and negotiate an agreement that Democrats and Republicans can agree to before we get to the floor. So I ask you to continue to consider that. As my colleagues know, the Commercial Space Launch Act amendments of 1988 established a three-tier system for allocating risk between the launch provider and the U.S. government. As part of the requirements for securing an FAA launch license, a launch provider must obtain third-party liability insurance. The level of insurance is based on an FAA determination of maximum probable loss, which is the estimated losses from third-party claims that may arise from death, bodily injury, or loss of or damage to property. The second tier of the regime transfers responsibility to the U.S. government, read taxpayers, for any payment of third-party claims in excess of the MPL with a cap of $1.5 billion in 1989 dollars. Currently, that's about $2.7 billion as adjusted for inflation, subject to appropriations. This is commonly referred to as government indemnification, taxpayer liability. The third tier transfers risk back to the launch provider or the legally liable party for any third-party claims that exceed the MPL insurance and government indemnification. In addition, the statute establishes requirements for third-party liability insurance against potential claims by the U.S. government, by the United States, for losses or damage to U.S. property. The legislative deliberations over the 1988 amendments appeared to envision the indemnification regime as an interim measure until the commercial launch industry became more mature. It has now been in place for 25 years. On January 16, 2014, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2014, and as part of it extended government indemnification by an additional 3 years until December 31, 2016. It was the 8th extension of those provisions since they were first passed in 1988. And while this section of the bill requires some sensible reviews by the FAA on updating how it calculates the MPL, including reassessing the dollar values associated with single casualty and insurance for government facilities, it would also extend the indemnification to December 31st, 2023, a 7-year extension. And while I'm cognizant of the commercial space industry wanting to have a stable indemnification horizon for its planning purposes, a 7-year extension doesn't provide Congress with the flexibility some of our members need during this expected period of quite growing maturity in the industry to influence continued federal government involvement. My amendment proposes to extend the government indemnification period to December 31st, 2020. I would note that the Senate's draft commercial space bill also proposes an extension until December 31st, 2020. The 4-year extension would provide near-term stability to the industry while also giving Congress the flexibility to consider whether changes are needed in response to the plan and reviews directed in this provision. I urge my fellow members to support this amendment, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
I thought if the gentlewoman would yield, I thought from her initial comments about Chairman's intervention that she might offer and withdraw the amendment, but that's not her intent.
I was talking about divine intervention,
Oh.
not Chairman intervention.
All right. Are there any other members who wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment seeks to shorten the indemnification coverage in the underlying bill by 3 years. It is puzzling that the minority continues to offer amendments to reduce certainty in the commercial launch market. When the minority seeks to cause instability in these markets, they are threatening the jobs of thousands of Americans. These are hard-working, blue-collar men and women that depend on the extension of this law for their jobs to exist. They are depending on us to provide long-term certainty for their industry. The minority is threatening the livelihoods of these families with this amendment. The issue of launch indemnification has been extensively studied by this committee, the FAA, and the Government Accountability Office. The GAO reported extensively on the indemnification regime, so too has the Aerospace Corporation. This committee held numerous hearings that included an examination of the regime. Exhaustive questions have been asked and exhaustive answers have been given about this important law. We do not need any more studies or any more delays. We need action. The extension in the underlying bill will support the commercial space industry and our economy. For the next 8 years, space launch providers will have the stability and assurance to compete in the international market. This means hard-working Americans will be able to go home at night knowing that their economic well-being will not be threatened because Congress couldn't pass an extension to this important law. For these reasons, I cannot support this amendment and ask my colleagues to do the same.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last
The
word.
gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I support Ms. Edwards' amendment. My reading of the legislative deliberations surrounding the 1988 amendments is that the indemnification regime was envisioned as an interim measure until the commercial launch industry became more mature. As noted earlier, the indemnification regime has been extended numerous times over the past quarter century, most recently January the 16th, 2014. That extension continued the third-party liability and indemnification provisions for the additional 3 years to December 31st, 2016. This amendment would extend the date to December 31st, 2020, a 4-year extension. Mr. Chairman, the commercial space industry has come a long way since the 1988 amendments. Not only has it come a long way, but it's growing and changing as companies and entrepreneurs continue to generate new ideas and technical concepts for potential commercial space transportation systems and related operations. The 4-year extension proposed by Ranking Member Edwards gives Congress the flexibility to adapt future policies to a fluid environment. It is worth noting that the Senate's draft commercial space bill also proposes an extension of 4 years rather than the 7-year extension in this bill. I urge members to support this amendment, and I thank you for being heard, and I yield back to ballot.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to point out that even assuming that one accepts in principle the idea of a limitation of liability and indemnification, this particular provision is hopelessly inadequate in that regard. The underlying statute that we're amending and extending here is one that limits liability to $1.5 billion plus an adjustment for inflation for each launch. The corresponding provision under the Price-Anderson Act for a nuclear incident is $13 billion plus an adjustment for inflation. So we're talking about barely 1/10 of the limitation of liability that the government, in my opinion, improperly has imposed on a nuclear accident. And in fact, when such an accident occurred in Fukushima, the physical cleanup costs alone in Fukushima were $137 billion. And in fact, there is a parallel here that's obvious because from time to time nuclear matter is launched into orbit. So why are we saying that a company has to pay no more than $1.5 billion for any incident or accident involved here when we actually have a situation that we've experienced where the physical cleanup costs alone, not the health costs, not the cost to safety, not the cost to the environment, but just the physical cleanup costs alone were $137 billion. This makes no sense to me on any basis whatsoever, even if you accept the principle of indemnification. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I'll repeat myself. I think keeping the time period for indemnification short is something that's appropriate, giving the long learning period that Mr. Knight's amendment allows. So either you don't have regulation and you don't have indemnity so that the private market manages this thing, or if you're going to have, or you have regulation and you have indemnity. I want to grow, I want to see the country grow its space business. Absolutely. And I've been a big supporter of national flood insurance and terrorism risk insurance, so obviously I don't have a problem with a federal role making sure that we can cover some of these costs. But here we're acting at cross purposes. We want to have a good business, we want to grow it, but we got to make it also police itself to some degree. And by having no regulation and no indemnity, we're doing just the opposite. So I would support the gentlewoman's amendment. She tries to limit the time period a little bit, and I think then we can start growing this thing and see if the indemnity ever comes into play. And I would suggest that that's the better course of action as this bill evolves. And I urge the passage of Ms. Edwards' amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Other members to be heard? If not, the question is on the Edwards amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Opinion of the chair, the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Is not agreed to. The gentleman.
I would ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested pursuant to committee rules. Recorded vote on the amendment will be postponed. Next amendment up is a gentleman from Florida's amendment.
I have an amendment that's asked.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 2 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Grayson
Without
of
objection,
Florida.
the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I think the ground's been covered, so I ask for unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Appreciate his doing that, and I was hopeful that that would occur. The next amendment is to be offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, and she's recognized for that purpose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Your mic's not on.
I have an amendment.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 008 to H.R. 2262, offered by Ms. Johnson of Texas. Page 9, line 8 through page 10.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment proposes to strike Section 4 of launch license flexibility. The need for this language has been overtaken by events. This section was sought over a year ago to benefit the launch company, Virgin Galactic. That was subcontracting its launch vehicle development and testing a different company, Scale Composites. Under current law, Virgin Galactic cannot concurrently hold a commercial launch license while Scaled Composites holds an experimental permit for testing and improvements to the same launch vehicle. However, after the October 2014 crash of Spaceship Two, Virgin Galactic decided to assume the responsibility for future testing of its experimental vehicles. The expectation that other companies might have a need for such specific provision does not have merit. In addition, there is currently a National Transportation Safety Board accident investigation into the test flight of Spaceship Two. This flight occurred under Scaled Composites experimental permit. Proposing to change the statute concerning license and experimental permits before the conclusion of an accident investigation is really not sensible. This amendment is a responsible action to respond to an unnecessary proposal to change the existing statute. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized in opposition.
Thank you very much, and I do rise in opposition to this amendment. With all due respect, we understand that we are not rubber stamps over here, and I don't believe that the other side of the aisle are knee-jerk rejectionists either. We just have to take a look at what each proposal is and have some honest disagreements, and I think this is certainly one of the areas where we have an honest disagreement. This section that this amendment proposes to strike is crucial to the health of the commercial space launch industry, and it is a good thing to help industry when it provides jobs and provides economic well-being for our country. And I have, and I know that some people, and again, we're being charged that everything we do is straight from the industry. Well, no, but sometimes it is a very positive thing to help a company, especially in a developing field like this, get started, get on the right track so that they can hire hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of Americans. And so this amendment would tie the hands of the commercial space launch providers that are trying to make improvements in the safety system while operating in good faith under their launch licenses. For this reason, I certainly can't support the amendment, and I would ask my colleagues to oppose it. The launch license flexibility section of this underlying bill will provide much-needed flexibility to the commercial space launch industry, something I know that we can all support. And it will allow the industry to innovate and invest in upgrades to existing launch vehicles and spaceship designs and launch that and allow that to continue the hard job of improving safety conditions and the safety of what they're manufacturing while they can improve it while they're under the license. This topic and the manner of amending the statute to permit this flexibility have been discussed well over a year now. Launch license flexibility applies, and in fact we had a hearing on this. There's lots of time to discuss it. This isn't something we're forcing down anybody's throats without a major discussion. The launch license flexibility applies to any company that wants to fly an operational vehicle while continuing to actually improve its design. And we should be encouraging people to improve the design even though they've got a license to operate already. This impacts this section of the bill, and the impacts are wide-ranging and will allow for rapid design development and the maturity of crucial mission safety and assurance systems. So this is going to have a very positive impact. We're giving some flexibility here, but we're preventing people from, because they have a license, not spending the money on improving their product. Without this provision, a company that holds an experimental permit loses that permit as soon as that design is licensed by the FAA. This has real-world implications. Companies like Scaled Composites build and design vehicles under experimental permits. They then transfer those vehicles to other companies like Virgin Galactic for operation. Without this relief that we're talking about, Scaled Composites would lose its experimental permit the moment that Virgin Galactic receives a license for that vehicle. Well, we shouldn't. We should be encouraging these changes in design and whatever if it's improving the basic product. While this specific example may be overcome by events now that Virgin Galactic will test under its license, the problem could arise again in the near future with other emerging companies. So again, we shouldn't. And to the point that my colleague, Mr. Grayson, made about some of the things being subsidies for a business. Well, if you don't believe, specific businesses, well, if you don't believe that lawyers should have as much power over American industry in general by trying to relieve that is not a subsidy to that company. It's just that you're having to do this systematically, make that change in general. You advocate that change in general. And in terms of what we're talking about here, we're talking about trying to relieve a nonsensical change in the law that are part of the law, that even in our hearings, we had a FAA Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation, George Neild. He gave testimony in this hearing, said this makes no sense at all. And he's representing the administration, and we also have the same sort of reform that's being suggested in the Senate with bipartisan support. So it seems to me that this, I would ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and would hope that we could be a little bit more bipartisan rather than just jumping to oppose this, which, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Everett, recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out a couple of things, and I do rise in support of the gentlelady's amendment. The FAA says it doesn't need this section and this provision. It already has the flexibility that's needed, and that, frankly, has been demonstrated actually by Virgin Galactic, oddly enough. And so I'm just trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to fix. There isn't a problem. The FAA has the flexibility that it needs. The experimentation that needs to take place in the industry has in fact been taking place, and we have the example of Virgin Galactic to demonstrate that. And so I hate the idea that we have a section here in the bill that seeks a flexibility that the agency says it doesn't need, that the industry hasn't demonstrated that it needs, and that we're creating yet another structure in an environment where we don't need it. So it kind of begs the question of why, and it would have been nice to see that there was some demonstration that, in fact, the industry requires the kind of flexibility that is envisioned under this proposed section of the statute. In fact, I think officials from the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation have actually indicated that a commercial launch license actually enables the launch provider to carry out testing, improvements to a vehicle, providing the license and specifying such activities when they obtain the license. And so I just question what it is that we're trying to fix, and I would urge the adoption of the gentlelady's amendment, and with that I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The question is on the Johnson amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Opinion chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Next up is an amendment by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would appropriately designate the way non-astronauts...
The gentleman will suspend for just a minute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Sorry, sir.
Amendment 012 to H.R. 2262.
Out of objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman continues to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would appropriately designate the way non-astronaut and foreign astronaut participants are defined in the Space Act. Up to this point, the term astronaut has never been clearly defined in the statute, and the final language in the underlying bill may have far-reaching implications, so it's important to get it right. When the CSLA was written, no one envisioned a future where government astronauts would fly on commercial vehicles. So neither of the two definitions in the CSLA, space launch participants and crew, effectively covered NASA astronauts aboard commercial vehicles. Because the CSLA requires these two categories of individuals to waive claims against the U.S. government, NASA was rightly concerned that government astronauts would be waiving their right to collect workers' compensation in the event of an injury on the job. So the majority's inclusion of the new language relating to government astronauts was in direct response to these NASA concerns. However, the majority's language does not address some of the ambiguous situations created in the language. For example, commercial space operations are likely to have missions other than those directly related to ISS. So the definition of foreign astronauts should not be limited by that agreement, as the underlying bill directs. Additionally, NASA has already trained and flown on the shuttle foreign astronauts, both as mission specialists and as payload specialists, from countries which were not signatories to the original IGA. So it also makes no sense to expand the definition of government astronauts to other countries besides signatories to the IGA, especially since commercial space missions may not be headed to the ISS. Another issue with the majority's definitions is failure to take into account that there might be U.S. government employees, like government researchers, who have not been trained as astronauts but who will still need to fly on a commercial space launch as part of their employment activities. In this foreseeable scenario, these individuals would not meet the standard of government astronaut. Thus, they would have to be defined under one of the two CSLA definitions, in which case they would still be vulnerable to the same cross-waiver indemnification problems that the underlying legislation intended to address. So to fix this problem, my amendment would add a section creating a new category, United States government spaceflight participant, to ensure these individuals were accounted for in the definitions of the Act. Mr. Chairman, as you can see, there are many unanswered questions, and I'm interested in working with the majority to address these uncertainties, and therefore I will withdraw my amendment and look forward to working with you on this prior to floor consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Appreciate your withdrawing the amendment, and we will work together between now and the House floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The next amendment is going to be offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 009 to H.R. 2262, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman will be recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. While, again, I think that there are many elements, as we can see, a couple of years here, a couple of years there, on which we actually could have come to an agreement, I believe. It's kind of unfortunate that we're not doing that. And so with that said, I offer my amendment, which proposes to strike Section 6 of 2262 on indemnification of spaceflight participants. And I would propose a study to identify the issues related to spaceflight participants and third-party liability. This is uncharted territory. When CSLA was passed in 2004, spaceflight participants were explicitly excluded from the third-party liability regime because those who were envisioned to fly on commercial human spaceflight vehicles would be wealthy individuals who presumably could indemnify themselves. Well, today there are situations such as research work that could involve non-wealthy individuals as spaceflight participants, there are questions that deserve further examination before determining policy on this matter. One key question is, who should bear the risk for third-party liability in the case of flights with spaceflight participants? Pretty straightforward question. For example, let's take the skydiving industry, which is a high-risk adventure and recreational sport. According to the United States Parachutes Association, parachuters can obtain their own third-party liability insurance through membership in the association. Accidental death and dismemberment insurance is available for an additional fee, and third-party liability insurance for exhibition jumps must be obtained separately. Should spaceflight participants be required to purchase their own third-party liability insurance? Should that risk be shared with the launch provider or the federal government, or both? You see, Mr. Chairman, my amendment proposes that the Government Accountability Office study the issues, the questions, and the options on spaceflight participants and third-party liability, and any potential cost to the federal government related to those options. I would note that even as we've had conversations over the last several Congresses about indemnification, we actually have not had a discussion about spaceflight participant indemnification. This study would provide the necessary insight to inform Congress's consideration of policy in this area. I also note that the Senate did not include a provision on indemnification of spaceflight participants in its draft commercial space bill. This amendment proposes a very sensible step forward, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
So I rise in opposition to the amendment, and this amendment would strike a critical component of the underlying bill necessary to protect spaceflight participants from financial ruin should an accident occur. And we're talking about spaceflight participants. We're talking about people who volunteer to get onto a craft and go into space. I will never do that. That's fine. But if you if someone chooses to take this kind of risk, and our space industry is trying their best to lower the risk, but I'm still not going to do it. But certainly I understand that people should have the right to waive liability costs, their ability to sue other people, or especially their ability to have somebody sue them because they happen to be on a craft that crashes or has some problem and goes down. The problem the underlying bill seeks to resolve was first brought to the attention of the committee as early as 2013. Despite questions and erroneous assertions about not having enough information about informed decisions, we have had hearings that this would have been very relevant to go into. The committee has held 3 separate hearings in the last 2 years that gave everybody the opportunity to ask questions, to ask these questions, rather than having to do it. But nobody asked these questions. It was obviously not important enough then to get this information. Well,
would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Are you talking about you're talking about the cross waivers? This is about spaceflight participants.
Yeah, that's right. But you can bring that is not an issue you could not bring up in these hearings. That was totally available to you, and reclaiming my time. We could, if this was an important issue in terms of whether or not people should be able to waive their indemnification, or if they should be protected, being able to be protected from being sued. These are things that we could have talked about. Without this section in the underlying bill, now this bill, what we're going to find out is the only people who are going to be able to afford a trip to space will be the mega rich. Billionaires are not the only people that should be able to someday travel into space. That should not be the way we organize the structure. There already have been contests run, for example, to offer rides to various people on these commercial vehicles. For example, the popular TV sitcom Big Bang Theory ran a contest for its fans in which the winner was given a free flight on X-Corps aerospace launch vehicles Well, these people who won the contest are not necessarily rich. They're lucky, but they're not rich. And they should be able to do that. And certainly we should not set up a system where they will be sued because they have agreed to take a ride on this private this spacecraft that's not a government-run program. The inclusion of spaceflight participants in the regime does absolutely nothing to prevent third parties from recovering damages related to a launch. But this language ensures that if some accident occurs, the spaceflight participant or their estate will not be legally liable to for the damages greater than those covered under the indemnification. This section ensures the promise of space economy is not just provided to the wealthy. These opportunities, as I say, should be given to everyone, and I think that's what Americans' technology has always been about. We're aiming at trying to find and develop systems and new technologies that will serve broad cross sections, where in some other societies they spend all of their money on elites. And I would ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment because it would have the wrong kind of impact on our whole space, on this type of commercial space endeavor, and on actually the rights and dreams of ordinary Americans, some of whom kids who don't come from rich families do dream about going into space and being involved in programs like SpaceX and others. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Are there others who wish to be heard? The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to strike the last word. I'd like to yield to Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much. And just very briefly, I just want to clarify that my amendment actually seeks to look at how we need to make sure that spaceflight participants who are not wealthy individuals can have third-party liability protection. And so, but there are a number of questions that are raised by that, and so what my amendment does is it says, let's ask those questions and then figure out what the regime is that we need to ensure that spaceflight participants who may be a researcher at a university or somebody who doesn't have the capacity has the ability to go to space, and not just the wealthy individuals who clearly could indemnify themselves, or maybe they wouldn't want to because they just feel like going. That's fine. And so I just want the gentleman to be clear that what my amendment does is it proposes that we try to address some of these questions so that we can make sure in the future that we can have spaceflight participants who are not wealthy individuals but who also would not bear the risk of the kind of liability that the gentleman from California describes. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time back to Ms. Johnson.
And yield for just a question.
Sure.
If you want a study done, would you accept, if we accept your study, but it doesn't eliminate that section of the bill, would you agree to it? Because we can, it's going along with the study. I mean, who's going to oppose that? But in the meantime, eliminating that section of the bill will mean that that's what the result is already.
No, I want us to, reclaiming Ms. Johnson's time, I want to, I just want to be clear that I think we understand that there are questions that are raised so that we can make certain that people like researchers who may indeed legitimately want to travel to space in the commercial arena have the ability to get the kind of protection that they need, but we need to make certain that the questions that we're asking, especially at this early stage, are the ones that we need to address. And that's all my amendment tries to do, because I think that we do have to come back and figure out what the liability concerns are and how we can address those for people who are not wealthy individuals and who have legitimate research or other interests in going to space. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time back to Ms. Johnson.
You want to yield back?
I yield back.
Okay. The gentleman from Texas yields back, and the question is on the Edwards Amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment, I believe, will also be offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, and if so, she is recognized for that purpose. This, I believe, would be the...
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 009 to...
I think it's 006.
Right. Yeah.
Does the gentlewoman want to withdraw the amendment? We can talk about that between now and...
Oh, not this one.
Okay. Is it the...
Mr. Chairman, I do not seem to have a copy of the amendment at the desk.
006?
We will get it to you.
Thank you, sir. Amendment 006 to H.R. 2262, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland. Page 14, lines 3 through 9, strikes Section 7.
The gentlewoman is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really important amendment. It would strike Section 7 from the bill, which is entitled Federal Jurisdiction. And under this section, amends the United States Code to make federal courts the sole courts of jurisdiction for any action or tort arising from a licensed launch or reentry. This provision would also require that these cases be decided under federal law. Now, just providing that all these cases should be tried in federal courts is significant enough. This is a very serious change to the United States Code and a usurpation of state legal sovereignty. It would be worthy of its own hearing to discuss the significant issues relating to this. Of course, it would probably be worthy of a hearing in the Judiciary Committee as well. We've not had such a hearing, so the majority is proposing to make this major legal change totally in the dark. However, the significance of the change pales in comparison to the requirement that all of these cases must be decided under federal law. And the reason is because, guess what? There is no federal tort law. As the American Association of Justice has noted in the letter they sent yesterday, and I would ask that that be submitted for the record, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the letter from the...
With that objection, so ordered.
Thank you. But they say in the letter, quote, since there is no federal tort law applicable to private companies, there is no remedy available to anyone injured or any property damage incurred as a result of a negligent launch or reentry. Essentially, Section 7 provides immunity for recklessness and intentional misconduct. Notably, this immunity could stretch to foreign companies involved in commercial space travel at the expense of United States citizens, businesses, and government, end quote. And so for this reason, AAJ opposes this section of the bill. This really is quite an indefensible provision. On the one hand, the majority is putting off safety regulations until well into the next decade. And on the other hand, the majority is essentially barring anyone from almost any legal action against a negligent or reckless launch provider for any injuries caused by a launch. With this provision, the majority is basically providing the launch industry with complete immunity from any civil action. Now, I want to point out that just in the past year, the U.S. commercial launch industry has suffered from two very significant accidents, one of which resulted in an unfortunate death. In this backdrop, are we really going to say to the industry that they can act unaccountably? That seems grossly irresponsible to me, and I would urge my fellow members to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment before us seeks to strike a common sense provision of the Space Act, which would ensure all launch companies and spaceflight participants are treated equally before the law. As the commercial space launch market has grown, various states have enacted their own laws to foster the development of private space companies within their jurisdictions. The creation of multiple jurisdictions with differing laws creates a lack of consistency necessary for the market to grow and thrive. This disjointed structure presents opportunities for bad actors to venue shop and take advantage of both launch operators and spaceflight participants. Launches are licensed by the federal government, not state governments. International treaties, launch regulations, and range control are all governed under federal jurisdiction. Without this clarification, we have no idea how the states would handle these types of lawsuits. Further, it could create real inequalities in the way spaceflight participants and launch companies are treated in different regions of the country. By striking this provision, we have no idea how these disputes will be resolved. This amendment leaves these questions unanswered and uncertain. We just don't know what the unintended consequences are. Since the federal government is the authority responsible for licensing launches, and since the federal government is party to international treaties rather than the states, the underlying bill ensures that the federal courts have jurisdiction over any discrepancies that arise. For these reasons, I cannot support this amendment and ask my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. The gentlewoman from Oregon first will be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm speaking in strong support of my colleague, Ms. Edwards' amendment. As she explained, this bill doesn't just place jurisdiction over any action or tort in federal court. It also provides that it, quote, shall be decided under federal law. Well, there is no federal tort law applicable to private companies, so this actually results in no remedy whatsoever. So if we're discussing completely removing the right to a remedy for a wrong, we need to have a much more thorough discussion about that, not only here, but in the Judiciary Committee. Now, if there's an analogous effort to create a federal tort, if there is a problem, that's another discussion. But, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, if we are completely removing any right for a remedy, that's a serious issue. I urge that we support this amendment to remove this provision from this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bonamici. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized.
Thanks. And I'm just looking at the Space Treaty of 1967, and so Mr. Palazzo is correct that we have obligations as the launching state. And I think he's right about venue and personal jurisdiction as it applies to the use of the federal courts. Where I think the proposed bill is lacking is on what's the substantive law of torts that would be the basis for the claim in the federal court. And so I would say absolutely right on venue and personal jurisdiction. That's where I think these legal disputes belong in the federal courts, but we have to have some body of law that the courts use to determine the dispute. So that's the place where we've got there's got to be some work done in this particular bill. So I don't know exactly how to do that or how we want to develop it, but so the right place to try these things is the federal court system. We got to have something more to be able to do that properly. With that, I'd yield back.
I notice that the gentleman from Colorado is the only member of the committee who does not need a microphone. And are there other members who wish to be recognized? If the gentlewoman from Texas, do you wish to be recognized? Yeah. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I'd like to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I support the gentlelady from Maryland's amendment. This amendment would strike one of the most egregious provisions in the majority's bill. The provision in question would essentially provide federally licensed launch providers with immunity from most of the types of civil action. That's the interpretation of the American Association of Justice. I know many people don't like trial lawyers, but they're experts. They do have the experts on this trial law. It really is unconscionable that in the same bill where the majority is delaying safety regulations until the next decade, they're also providing unqualified immunity to the launch industry regardless of how careless their unregulated actions are. I also note that the Senate did not include a similar provision in its draft bill. I would suggest that we support Ms. Edwards' amendment and help bring this bill more in line with what the Senate Republicans have proposed. I thank you and yield back. Speak on behalf of the people.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Opinion of Chair, the noes have it. The amendment
Mr. Chairman?
not agreed to. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Gentlewoman from Maryland asked for a recorded vote, and pursuant to committee rules, the vote on the amendment will be postponed. Okay, next amendment is to be offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 007 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York. Page 14, lines 10.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment. Oh, no.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The emerging area of commercial space transportation, especially commercial space transportation of humans, is exciting, and I certainly want it to succeed. That said, there are many areas of policy proposed in this bill for which we have not held hearings or examined fully. Cross waivers of liability is one of those areas. Mr. Chair, my amendment proposes to strike Section 8 of H.R. 2262 on cross waivers of liability. It is argued that if spaceflight participants are presented with the risks of spaceflights and must sign informed consent, then they should also be required to waive liability against the other parties in the launch. That means that spaceflight participants waive their rights to sue the launch provider and related parties for claims. What about gross negligence? FAA regulations note that the intent of Congress in the 2004 Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act was not to apply such cross waivers to gross negligence. So, Mr. Chair, I would like to think that as we approach the time when commercial human spaceflight becomes operational, spaceflight participants can count on more than just intent in the case of gross negligence. And how would the knowledge that a spaceflight participant has waived all rights to sue the launch provider affect the provider's approach to safety? Mr. Chair, cross waivers of liability might make sense if there were some assurances that regulations on the safety of spaceflight participants on a commercially licensed spaceflight system were in place. However, H.R. 2262 proposes a lengthy moratorium on such regulations, while also proposing to protect the launch provider from any claims by a spaceflight participant. Cross waivers affect the rights of individuals on important safety matters. We need to get it right, and my amendment is a responsible action at this point in time. In addition, my amendment reflects the Senate's current stance on this issue, which was not to include a provision on cross waivers of liability in its draft commercial space bill. Finally, I would like to note that the American Association for Justice has written a letter to the committee noting their strong opposition to this provision. As AAJ notes in its letter, and I quote, "While it may be acceptable for businesses with equal footing and negotiating power to execute cross waivers limiting their responsibility to each other, this waiver language should not extend to passengers," and I close quote. So I strongly agree with this sentiment, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Ms. Strike, last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment seeks to strike an important section of the bill that ensures both spaceflight participants and launch providers are protected under the informed consent regimes through the use of cross waivers. The CSLA, the Commercial Space Launch Act, requires all spaceflight participants to receive informed consent regarding the inherently risky activity in which they are participating. Although informed consent is required, there is no statutory enforcement or protection for the launch providers. This provides financial uncertainty for the companies and can slow the growth of commercial space industry as a whole. And of course, everyone on this committee says they support the commercial space industry and they want to help the commercial space industry prosper. This doesn't do that. By contrast, in the case of a payload launch, a mutual waiver of claims is required as part of the license for all parties to the launch. This structure has served the space payload industry and the launch providers very, very well. The provision in the underlying bill requires the launch spaceflight participants to follow the same regulatory practices as payload providers. That makes a lot of sense. The courts have held, and the FAA has included in their regulations, specific direction for relief in the case of gross negligence or willful misconduct. Two separate federal court cases in the 4th District held that claims of gross negligence are not waived according to the court's dicta under the 1988 amendments to the Commercial Space Launch Act. The preamble to Part 440 of the FAA's regulations related to waivers of claim explicitly recognizes that Congress intended, this is a quote, Congress intended the statutory revisions of 1988 and of 2004 to reduce litigation expenses by requiring launch participants to assume responsibility for their own losses, except in cases of gross negligence. Human spaceflight, as we all know, is an inherently risky endeavor. The section in the underlying bill is necessary to ensure that participants understand the risk involved in a flight into space. We must ensure that both launch providers and spaceflight participants are taking part in commercial human spaceflight with all the appropriate protections in place for everyone's well-being. For these reasons, I can't support this amendment and ask my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. Are there others who wish to be heard on the Tonko amendment? The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm supporting Mr. Tonko's amendment. This amendment is a practical approach to a policy in an area that deserves close consideration by this committee. In addition to the points raised by Mr. Tonko on adding spaceflight participants to cross waivers of liability, there are questions as to what extent such liabilities have been tested. Moreover, the statute is silent on the applicability of the cross waivers to gross negligence, and this gives me pause. The amendment prevents premature action that could have potential negative consequences. There is no urgency for including such a provision in H.R. 2262. So we should adopt this amendment and try and make some kind of effort to better understand the issue. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The question is on the Tonko amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Opinion of the Chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed.
Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from New York asked for a recorded vote, and pursuant to committee rules, a vote on this amendment will be postponed. We'll now go to an amendment to be offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 014 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Bridenstine of Oklahoma. Page 17, after line 25.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for all your leadership and your commitment to commercial space. I'd especially like to thank you for a clarification that a launch license and an experimental permit can be issued for the same design, which will go a long way toward encouraging the continued growth of the commercial space industry. My amendment addresses an issue that will become more prevalent as this industry continues to expand and diversify. Specifically, space support vehicles, by which I mean experimental aircraft, such as hybrid launch systems, and test vehicles, or training vehicles. I want to give some examples. When it comes to my state of Oklahoma, we have a spaceport. That spaceport is well suited for horizontal launch capabilities, which means a carrier aircraft will be required. As it stands right now, a carrier aircraft for a launch vehicle ultimately comes under two regulatory regimes. What I'd like to see is I'd like to see the process streamlined so that that carrier aircraft with a launch license or an experimental permit, that single carrier aircraft can have their process streamlined. So you can fly that carrier aircraft without having to go through multiple different jurisdictions at the FAA to get that carrier aircraft permitted. Additionally, when you think about other areas that are important to the state of Oklahoma, there's going to be training requirements for commercial crew, commercial astronauts, for commercial spaceflight participants. For this, we need training. One of the challenges we have is a lot of the training requirements. If you think about a T-38, that's what NASA uses to train their astronauts. You do high G maneuvers. You stay proficient by using a T-38. Well, as it relates to T-38s in the commercial sphere, that's an experimental aircraft. And the commercial industry is not allowed to hire experimental aircraft, whether it's for transportation of cargo or for training astronauts. So we need to streamline, I think, some of the processes by which permits and licenses are approved. Last year, Minority Leader McCarthy, who is the sponsor of the bill we are currently considering, and our Science Committee colleague, Mr. Posey, sent a letter to the FAA requesting draft language, quote, to permit the safe use of experimental aircraft in support of U.S. commercial spaceflight activities. I ask unanimous consent to place the FAA's response in draft language into the record.
Without objection.
Originally, I'd hoped the language would be included in the underlying bill, but it has become apparent that there are some industry stakeholders and some members of this panel, as well as the FAA, that have concerns that the proposal might cause more problems than it solves, particularly when it comes to providing adequate levels of safety. I appreciate my colleagues' concerns, but it is important we address this issue while the committee has the opportunity. I believe there's an emerging testing and training industry statutorily restricted, and a whole class of vehicles and aircraft that are in regulatory limbo, especially as it relates to training of commercial crew, commercial astronauts, and commercial spaceflight participants. This is why my amendment requires a GAO report. I want to be clear, it's just a GAO report that will capture the role of space support vehicles in the commercial space industry, especially as it relates to regulatory and statutory barriers to the services these vehicles offer, and recommendations for updates that will address these barriers. Mr. Chairman, I wish I could go further at this time toward clarifying the role these vehicles will have as the commercial space industry continues to rapidly expand. However, this amendment is an important first step, just a simple GAO report, one which will give us on this committee and those at the FAA information we need to enact new laws or promulgate smart regulations that accurately capture the state of the industry. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can continue to work together on this issue, and that once we receive this report, we can quickly hold hearings and try to pass laws on the recommendations that it lays out. This is critically important to the industry that we address this issue proactively. With that, I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine, and I support the amendment as well. Is there another member who wishes to be heard? If not, all in favor of the Bridenstine amendment say aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Posey?
I just want to strike the last word.
Okay. Time is of essence this afternoon, but I'll be happy to recognize the gentleman from Florida.
I'll wait my time. This is a great amendment, and I appreciate your support.
Okay, succinctly put. All in favor of the Bridenstine amendment say aye. And opposed, nay. The amendment is agreed to. And next up is back to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 025 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Posey of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I will be very brief. I'd like to thank the Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, for his leadership on this legislation and his ongoing interest in commercial space. I think everyone on this committee would agree that the commercial sector is increasingly playing a larger and more important role in our civil and national defense space needs. This amendment is straightforward as can be. It would streamline commercial space activities to eliminate the red tape and bureaucracy that is impeding the development of the commercial space sector. Federal launch ranges can provide many benefits for these companies, including skilled workforces, local supply bases, shared infrastructure, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, even with those benefits, we've seen commercial launch companies leaving these sites. That should be a cause for concern for members of this committee especially. Policymakers in Washington must adapt to an evolving launch industry by rethinking and reforming the way government installations license for and approve commercial launches. It is clear our current approach isn't working. It's too burdensome, duplicative, and costly. A streamlined approval process that reflects the changing landscape of the launch industry is an important step in addressing this issue. Streamlining the approval process and encouraging cooperation between government agencies is crucial to making U.S. companies more competitive in the global marketplace. It will also be more cost-effective both to private companies and the government by cutting down on the duplicative efforts of cross agencies. The language is the same as the space bill that Senators Nelson, Rubio, Cruz et al. Have been working on the Senate side. So I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment to facilitate cooperation and cut red tape to spur on commercial space in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I'm glad you offered the amendment, and the gentlewoman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to offer gentle opposition to Mr. Posey's amendment. I think that the amendment would impose some additional and probably unnecessary paperwork burdens and divert scarce resources away from licensing activities. I'd like to note that in the fiscal year 2016 THUD appropriations bill, there wasn't there were no additional funds allocated to the Office of Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. Perhaps if the office had been allocated additional resources, my position on this amendment would be a little bit different. If the gentleman would consider withdrawing his amendment, I would really like to work with him on a streamlined amendment that wouldn't impose additional burdens on what I think is an already stretched FAA office. I'm not fundamentally opposed to what the gentleman is trying to accomplish. I'm just opposed to overburdening the office with work when the regulated industry, and we are celebrating that, is rapidly growing while the office's budget is remaining flat. So if the gentleman would consider withdrawing his amendment, I'd be happy to work with him so that we could support his idea, which we think is a good one. Otherwise, we'll have to generally oppose this amendment for the reasons I mentioned.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Sure.
I would like to say I support the gentleman's amendment. I would also like to work with you on the budget for the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. I think that there is bipartisan recognition that this industry is growing very rapidly and that agency is stretched as far as it can be stretched, and it needs additional funding. And if you would support this amendment of Mr. Posey, I would work with you on increasing the funding for the Office of Commercial Space Transportation up to the level that the President requested in his budget request.
Interesting offer. I think you pointed out what the fundamental problem is with the amendment, and that's why I'm saying it's not the idea, because we know that the industry is growing. It's growing at such a rapid pace. We agree that's a good thing. But the budget, in fact, has been flatlined. And so I think we'd have to do that in conjunction with the amendment, which is why I offered to Mr. Posey the ability to do that, so that all of us could actually be very supportive of what he's trying to do. But with that, I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back her time. Are there any other members who wish to be heard? If not, the vote is on the Posey amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. A very gentle nay. And the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment will be offered by the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, on behalf of Mr. Brooks, and Mr. Palmer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 013 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mr. Palmer of Alabama.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Striking the last word. This amendment will support further commercialization of space. Simply put, the amendment updates current law to reflect changes in our existing space systems by changing shuttle to space launch system in the relevant sections. We no longer fly the shuttle, but we are preparing to fly the space launch system. The Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel and NASA Advisory Council have all warned about dangers of low flight rate. The change offered in this amendment allows the federal government to utilize this important system for many purposes. The use of unique missions for the space launch system will help increase its launch rate, which will in turn increase safety. This amendment would allow the space launch system to carry out a wide range of functions for the federal government, including the Department of Defense on a reimbursable basis. This will decrease costs to the overall program while increasing safety and mission assurance. Finally, this amendment preserves the protections for commercial entities that currently exist under the law so that the space launch system will not compete with the private sector. This amendment will support the commercial space sector and improve safety and mission assurance at the same time. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. I believe that the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, has a secondary.
Yes, I have an amendment of the amendments.
And the clerk will report that amendment.
Second order amendment to Amendment 013, offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California. Page 2, line 14, strike beyond Earth orbit and insert directly to cislunar space and the regions of space beyond low Earth orbit.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
My amendment to the Brooks-Palmer amendment would replace the phrase beyond Earth orbit in the Brooks-Palmer amendment with the phrase directly to cislunar space and the regions of space beyond low Earth orbit. This language is, I believe, in keeping with the intent of Mr. Brooks and Mr. Palmer, but it reduces potential confusion with other transportation methods. The phrasing cislunar space and the regions of space beyond low Earth orbit is directly from Sections 302 of the NASA Authorization Act of 2010, which sets out our national space policy for using the Space Launch System as a follow-on vehicle to the Space Shuttle system. This language would help clarify our national policy of using commercial American launch vehicles to transport government astronauts to low Earth orbit. And I would note that nothing in this language would prohibit the NASA administrator from determining that special circumstances require that the SLS should be used to launch people into low Earth orbit, to the space station or other destinations. So I ask your support for this amendment and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Not on this one, excuse me. Is there any further discussion on the amendment to the amendment? If not,
we have no objection to the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to have a, no, you're going to request a recorded vote?
I am.
Right? Okay. Recorded vote will be requested on the secondary, not on Rohrabacher. Okay. Without objection, the Rohrabacher amendment is agreed to, so now we will go back to the underlying amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, and a recorded vote has been requested and pursuant to committee. Oh, the gentlewoman from Maryland wants to discuss the underlying amendment, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment. I don't actually understand why we're offering it here today. We just marked up a NASA bill only 2 weeks ago, and this amendment would have made sense along with Mr. Rohrabacher's amendment that was just agreed to, I suppose, had it been offered then. But it doesn't seem like it's the time or the place or the bill to be offering an amendment that is not really germane to the legislation that we're considering today. This amendment mandates specific SLS usage policies and pricing policies for the Department of Defense to use the SLS. It also adds restrictions to the use of the SLS for commercial payloads. There are some pretty major changes to the current understanding of how SLS will be used. There are some pretty major changes without a single hearing or a review of this proposal and outside the context of the NASA authorization that we marked up just a couple of weeks ago. What I find particularly interesting is that the amendment, while making these broad sweeping changes, then ignores the earlier shuttle pricing provisions in Chapter 703. Why did the gentleman not raise these ideas earlier so we could discuss them then? Why was this proposal not mentioned when we just passed a NASA reauthorization bill only 2 weeks ago? My strong support for SLS is a matter of record. I look forward to continuing to support the SLS. However, NASA has told us that there is no current need for the prescriptive provisions on the use of the SLS. If NASA doesn't think this is necessary, it seems at this time that this idea is more than a little bit premature to be bringing to the committee. I look forward to future hearings and eventually subcommittee markups on prescriptive language and legislation for the SLS. This amendment is neither germane to the legislation we're marking up today, nor has it gone through regular order to ensure we make informed decisions about such an important topic. As a result, I urge all my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. Is there any further discussion? If not, the vote is on the Palmer Amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed, nay.
No.
Any chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
And a recorded vote has been requested pursuant to committee rules. That vote will be postponed. Do we have any other amendments to be offered? If the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Comstock, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk
And
which I
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 000 to H.R. 2262, offered by Mrs. Comstock of Virginia.
Okay. The gentlewoman is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually plan to offer it and then withdraw after some brief remarks here. This bipartisan amendment, which is co-sponsored by my colleague Don Beyer, would help address a critical gap in the Commercial Space Launch Act that unintentionally leaves state and local government property exposed in the event of a launch or reentry accident. When the CSLA was originally enacted during the Reagan administration, few anticipated that rocket launches would one day regularly occur anywhere other than federal NASA and DoD spaceports. However, over the last several decades, fortunately, we have seen state governments start investing in improvements to federal spaceports or develop state-owned and operated spaceports. For example, the Commonwealth of Virginia owns and operates the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport at NASA Wallops, which plays a critical role in launching supplies to the International Space Station. Other examples include Alaska's Kodiak Spaceport and Space Florida's state investments in and around Kennedy Space Center, as well as other states currently working to develop similar capabilities. It's important that we ensure that federal laws support and encourage state and local efforts to invest in space launch infrastructure and that our policies are mutually reinforcing. State investments in spaceports save federal agencies like NASA and DoD money, and federal policies should be aimed at providing state and local governments with legal and regulatory certainty. The amendment would encourage continued state and local government investments by closing the existing gap in property insurance coverage in the FAA licensing process. Currently, the licensing process required under CSLA for any commercial launch directs a launch provider to procure insurance to cover any damage to federal property or third-party property. This amendment would ensure that state and local government spaceport property are covered the same way federal government property has been covered under this process for the last 30 years. However, the amendment would also provide states and launch providers with flexibility to voluntarily waive insurance coverage requirements if they so choose. This amendment strikes the right balance to ensure that taxpayer investments in state spaceports are protected, just as federal property has been for 30 years, while providing flexibility in case states and launch providers mutually agree to other terms. So I appreciate the Chairman's working with us on this measure, and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Comstock. And the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized. Okay. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer, is recognized.
So, Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to reiterate my distinguished colleagues' comments on our bipartisan amendment. We do believe this is an important issue to address as the process advances, and we really appreciate the willingness on both sides of the committees to work with us to refine this provision. I also wanted to share some comments made by the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation in the Senate testimony earlier this year in support of addressing this issue. Mr. Stallmer noted, quote, "With the rapid growth in the number of state spaceports, which are owned and operated by state governments, much like regional commercial airports, it's also important that the Commercial Space Launch Act be updated to extend the scope of property insurance coverage expressly to the property of state and local governments associated with licensed spaceports. This change would provide much-needed clarity to the insurance coverage for state spaceports and encourage more investment in space launch infrastructure throughout the U.S. As our national launch infrastructure continues to develop and increasingly benefits from new investments by state and local governments, this committee needs to make sure federal policies are keeping pace with new development and needs." So thanks to investments by states in recent years, we've doubled the number of spaceports in the U.S. capable of launching to orbit, and we've seen rapid growth of suborbital spaceports around the country. This is a very positive development, and we should be doing all we can to make sure that federal policies encourage these investments. And again, I'm grateful with Ms. Comstock to work for the committee to finalize this language. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. And now the gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to express my appreciation both to Ms. Comstock and to Mr. Byer for their amendment, because I believe this is an area that the committee should be addressing. Currently, the Commercial Space Launch Act does not expressly extend insurance coverage to state government developments around launch facilities. This is quite an unintentional gap in coverage, especially in the wake of last year's accidents at state spaceports, and it's something that clearly needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. Fixing this gap will protect federal, state, and local governments and encourage continued state development of spaceport facilities. And I applaud Ms. Comstock and Mr. Byer for working on this issue together, and I look forward to supporting their efforts in a bipartisan way as we move forward. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Comstock, has any? Is she going to withdraw it? Okay. Are you planning to withdraw the amendment? Okay. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. That concludes the amendments that I'm aware of on this particular bill, and we will roll the votes on the amendments and on the bill itself probably until after this series of votes that we expect to come up shortly. Meanwhile, we will go now to consideration of H.R. 1508. And pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1508, the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act of 2015, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1508, a bill to promote the development of United States commercial space research.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the author of the bill, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased the committee is considering our bipartisan, bicameral legislation, H.R. 1508, the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act. Thanks to you and your staff for helping refine this important legislation over the last year. Representative Derek Kilmer and I introduced this bill last Congress and again in March with additional support from several other members of this committee. I also appreciate the work and research of Senators Patty Murray and Marco Rubio to introduce identical legislation in the U.S. Senate. In crafting this legislation, House and Senate offices, Republican and Democrat, consulted the Federal Aviation Administration, the State Department, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, House Legislative Council, and, of course, the people in the commercial space industry. This 6-page bill is very straightforward. It gives legal certainty to U.S. space companies that resources they obtain in outer space from an asteroid are the property of the entity that obtained them. Period. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing else. Let me emphasize this bill does not apply to planets or moons. It does not deal with ownership of asteroids in any way. Again, it clarifies that if a company mines resources from an asteroid in outer space, it has a right of ownership. Importantly, this bill is crafted to allow for and indeed encourage innovation. The bill establishes a legal framework for recognizing space property rights without micromanaging the specific ways this exciting new industry would unfold. Again, had today's FAA been present in the early 20th century, I have my doubts if the Wright brothers would have made it off the ground yet. We know asteroids can be excellent sources of highly valuable resources like rare minerals, critical to our national security, yet imported from abroad for the most part. For example, Russia and South Africa hold 97% of the platinum group metal reserves on this planet. It's been claimed a single asteroid could contain more platinum than has ever been mined on Earth. Knowledge of asteroids, their number, location, composition, is increasing at a tremendous rate. Space technology has advanced to the point that the private sector is now able to begin exploring and developing resources in space. Americans are willing to invest in asteroid mining, but they want certainty that they can reap what they sow. So again, Mr. Chairman, for today's markup, I ask for the support of my colleagues for this common sense, bipartisan, well-vetted bill. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I think this is a much-needed bill and appreciate his offering it. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I plan to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute of the bill before us, and so I will discuss my concerns with this legislation in more depth at that time. As a result, I will confine my opening remarks to just a few main points. First, despite my deep concerns with the legislation as drafted, I want to commend Mr. Posey and Mr. Kilmer for introducing it and getting the discussion started on the issues raised by it. And those issues are complex, including questions related to our international treaty obligations. It is clear that different approaches to addressing those issues can have significant impacts down the road, and we need to get this right. Space resource utilization is a topic that may not be as urgent as many other matters before this committee, but we should be concerned with. But it is not silly either. I do not doubt that space resource utilization can become a reality at some point in the future, and it behooves us to spend the time to figure out the appropriate policy framework in advance. That is why I'm so disappointed that we are rushing this bill to full committee markup today. We've had no hearings nor roundtables devoted to issues raised by this bill in this Congress. Now we had a subcommittee markup where these issues could receive an airing. The only relevant hearing the committee has held on the subject was on a predecessor bill from last Congress. During that hearing, a well-known space law expert testified that there were some significant regulatory and legal challenges left unaddressed in the proposed legislation. That same expert has written a letter to the committee this week expressing her concerns about the bill before us today, and I ask that that be placed in the record. As a result, I will be offering an amendment that will help us start to get the information we need to develop thoughtful legislation that can enable space resource utilization to become a reality. Failing its adoption, I will be compelled to oppose the bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Do you still want to offer the amendment in the nature of a substitute, or just express your opposition to the bill?
No, I do plan to offer an amendment.
Okay, you're recognized for that purpose, and the clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment 005 in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1508, offered by Ms. Johnson of Texas.
With that, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement on this bill, I think the bill's authors have performed a service in starting a discussion of many issues it raises about property rights in space, international treaty obligations, and appropriate license and regulation of outer space activities. That said, I also think that we are not at all close to resolving these issues, and it is far too early to be marking up this legislation, and especially be marking it up in the absence of hearings and other venues for discussion of the issues, a legislative hearing, or even a subcommittee markup. In fact, the University of Mississippi space law expert invited by a majority last year to testify noted that some of the legal and regulatory issues that were unaddressed in the previous version of this bill. Just yesterday, in response to my request for comments on H.R. 1508, she provided a thoughtful letter, which I have already entered into the record. Let me cite some of the concerns she raises in her letter. First, she raised a very significant concern that the bill appears to be in conflict with the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, to which the United States is a signatory. That treaty prohibits national appropriations by claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. To quote Professor Gabrinovich, making unextracted in situ asteroid resources subject to U.S. federal law and requiring the president to meet national needs, which this bill does, is a form of national appropriation by other means. Second, she notes that the bill does not provide any specific licensing regime, which she points out is unprecedented in the United States space law, since, to quote in her letter, licensing is how the U.S. meets its obligations to authorize and continually supervise the space activities of non-government entities under the Outer Space Treaty. Mr. Chairman, in addition to her concerns, there are many other ambiguities and unresolved issues that need attention. In that regard, a significant concern with the bill as written is the lack of clarity as to the meaning of many of its terms. For example, obtained such resources is left undefined, with simply being the first to land a probe on an asteroid and have it collect a sample, whether or not it is returned to Earth, thereby confer property rights from that point forward onto the commercial company who sent the probe. In the rule of decision provision, how is one to define the activity that is reasonable for exploration and utilization of asteroid resources, and why are simple exploration activities included in the rule of decision at all? These questions become important because the bill is quite prescriptive in saying that the court should enter judgment in favor of the plaintiff. We are not going to be able to resolve any of these issues today, and so I think we need to take a step back and get the information we must have to make informed policy decisions. My amendment does just that by having the President convene an interagency study under the leadership of the Office of Science and Technology Policy and with the participation by all appropriate federal agencies. The interagency review would identify and assess potential governmental barriers to the development of economically viable, safe, and stable industries for the exploration and utilization of space resources in a manner consistent with the existing international obligations of the United States. The review would also identify appropriate roles and responsibilities and a proposed organizational structure for the federal government's oversight and licensing of commercial space resource exploration and utilization. And the review would identify any authorities necessary to meet the international obligations of the United States with respect to the exploration and utilization of space resources, including an examination of issues related to property rights issues, harmful interference, and national appropriations. It would also have the distinguished national academies consider these issues and offer its insights. Mr. Chairman, I want to work through these issues so that we can establish a stable environment in which this nascent industry and its investors can thrive. But if we are serious, we should make the effort to get the information we will need to make sensible decisions. And I believe my amendment does just that. I urge members to support this amendment, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member for her interest in this issue and what I'm sure is a well-intended amendment. Concerns with the ranking member's substitute amendment are that at the end of the day, it would simply require more and more and more studies of the issue without providing any of the benefits provided in the bill, mainly legal certainty for the companies and individuals involved. There have already been sufficient studies on this issue. In fact, last year this committee held a hearing on an earlier version, same substance virtually, of this bill, and in crafting this legislation, all involved parties and federal agencies were consulted. The Federal Aviation Administration, the State Department, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and of course the commercial space companies themselves that some people have today indicated it's evil if you get input from the people who actually do the work. Nonetheless, we consulted everybody who had any interest in this issue that we could think of. The proposed substitute amendment would replace the provisions with a series of reports and studies, all of which will take years to complete. Meanwhile, we won't be providing any of the leadership or certainty that Americans and American companies need to move forward. This committee can deliberate hypothetical situations without end, but that isn't leadership. H.R. 1508 is drafted to accommodate a new era in space exploration, asteroid mining, without the federal government prescribing exactly how to do that. We should lead the designs and techniques of space mining within an appropriate legal framework, of course, to the industry entrepreneurs who will actually be doing the work, rather than gather here in the Rayburn building and draft an exhaustive stack of more and more federal laws that run the risk of becoming outdated, ineffective, and or counterproductive in space. We know that foreign competitors are moving ahead with asteroid mining. The Russians and the Chinese sure aren't going to sit around and wait for Congress to study the issue to death. It is vitally important for this committee to help spur U.S. leadership in this next market, the vast market of outer space. So I respectfully ask my colleagues to vote against this substitute and support the underlying, heretofore, completely bipartisan legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized.
Thank you. I support Ms. Johnson's substitute, and I also support my friend Mr. Posey's desire to have some kind of body of law that allows for the exploitation of these resources. The trouble is we are a party to a treaty, as are 124 other countries, that says this. This is the Treaty of 1967 and all of its amendments, and it says the provisions of this agreement relating to the moon shall also apply to the other celestial bodies within the solar system other than the Earth, except insofar as specific legal norms enter into force. Then it says the moon is not subject to national appropriation by any claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. Neither the surface nor the subsurface of the moon nor any part thereof or natural resources in place shall become property of any state, intergovernmental or non-governmental organization, national organization, or non-governmental entity, or any natural person. Then it goes on, it says states that are party to the agreement, which the United States was the drafter of the treaty that these other 124 states joined, states parties to this agreement hereby undertake to establish an international regime including appropriate procedures to govern the exploitation of the natural resources of the moon and other celestial bodies as such exploitation is about to become feasible. So you're absolutely right. We got to get busy on this. But we're going to violate the treaty that we wrote unless we come up with the body of law that really sets forth how do we exploit and mine these resources.
Gentleman yield.
Certainly.
There's nothing in this act which calls for the United States to violate its international obligations. Nothing. The Outer Space Treaty is a treaty of guiding principles subject to interpretation by each of the states. It's the right of Congress to enact domestic legislation that takes into account and interprets the provisions of Outer Space Treaty, or in fact any treaty which the U.S. has ratified. I mean, I guess we could try and look at this from the view of our greatest competitor. It may be possible.
I'm
but
going to reclaim my time. Good. And I'm going to say, look, we wrote the treaty. Okay? The language is pretty clear. You are right. We've got to get a body of law that's developed as to how do we mine these resources, because they're going to be good for us and they're going to be good for others. And I think that you are definitely on the right track. We've got to get busy. This thing's got to be studied. We've got to present to all our treaty partners how all of us are going to be mining things up there without getting into a fight. Because there really isn't any law that establishes who has right to what particular resource. So I'm not disputing your desire to move forward on this. I'm just saying we have a treaty and we've got to do it in a certain way. Otherwise, we violate our own treaty. Now, we have the right under the treaty to step aside from the treaty give everybody 1 year's notice. But there is so much in that treaty about protecting our astronauts, recovering other space objects. You know, if one of our satellites lands in Russia or someplace like that. So I don't think we want to step away from the agreement, but we need to create that body of law. With that, I yield back and urge the passage of the substitute amendment.
Thank the gentleman. There's the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Mr. Perlmutter just said. I also think that the bill is clearly unconstitutional. It's, in my mind, not even a close question. First of all, if you can't hail into U.S. courts a Canadian company that has not done business in the United States, it's safe to say that you can't hail into U.S. courts a company in the asteroid Vesta that's not done business in the United States. Again, there is a requirement for minimal context under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and this bill doesn't even come close to requiring minimum context of a putative defendant in a U.S. court in this litigation that the bill is trying to establish. Secondly, it doesn't even purport to meet the cases or controversies requirement in Article 3 of the Constitution. Our courts are courts of limited jurisdiction in the sense that the Constitution says there are certain things that our courts can hear and certain things that our courts cannot hear. It's safe to say that a dispute between two mining companies on an asteroid 150 million miles away is not something that the founders contemplated being resolved by U.S. courts. Leaving aside the fact that the kind of mining we're talking about may never take place, and that we might as well be talking about how our foreign relations with little green men. Leaving that issue aside, this is simply an unconstitutional bill, and I can't support it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. The question is, I'm sorry, the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm just going to be very brief because here on the committee, I mean, we did hear from Professor Grabinowitz, who she is one of the foremost experts, actually, on the Outer Space Treaty and its applications and space law. And when she appeared before this committee, it seemed to me pretty clear that she believes that we do not have the ability to do this and still maintain our relationships within the context of the Outer Space Treaty. And so it begs the question, again, of why we're doing this. And I have to tell you, I'm not really moved by one company being able to come to members of the committee and lobby for a piece of legislation that potentially puts the United States at risk of violating its treaty agreements because they're interested in the future in making some money off of mining asteroids. Now, I do think that over some period of time, we really do have to figure this out. I mean, the world is, coming around, and the industries are developing, and it's a robust development, but our job here in the Congress is to make certain that we take cognizance of those changes, but that we do it in a responsible way, and that we create a body of law that maintains both our treaty obligations and relationships. And to simply say that the Outer Space Treaty is just a treaty on principles, that is true, but if one party to the agreement begins to violate those principles, it becomes the excuse for another party to the agreement to violate those same principles. I don't think that that's the way we want to operate in the context of space. And so I would urge the adoption of the amendment that's the substitute amendment that is in front of us, and not rush to judgment just because we want to do a good deal from one company that comes in front of the committee and happen to find a couple of friends who could move forward a piece of legislation. I just don't think that that's a very responsible way to act, and with due respect to my colleagues, because I do think that this is an important area where it is going to be critical for us as a Congress to come to some kind of consensus and to make sure that we have an underlying body of law that supports our ability and companies' ability to exploit space in a way that's going to be responsible. But this is not responsible. And, our doors should not just be open to somebody who comes and wants to do business, irrespective of whether that ability is immediately available or whether the payoff is immediately available. And with that, I yield.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support Ms. Johnson's amendment today, and I want to explain why. I have a lot of respect for the sponsors of this legislation, both of them, and I'm glad that it's bipartisan. And this has been a really fascinating discussion, and it really does reveal all of the issues around this very interesting concept and intriguing idea. And I agree that this is something we need to have a conversation about. But, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, we're having a markup here today, not a hearing. And as was identified in several of the comments of our colleagues here, there are several issues that need discussion and clarification. This is a really intriguing idea, but it's complex. And we have, as has been discussed, the Outer Space Treaty. How does that apply? What are we doing to that treaty if we're considering this legislation? It's especially interesting that this bill specifically sets out remedy and jurisdiction provisions sort of in contrast with the prior bill, which didn't have much at all, very specifically. And they seem to require that summary judgment be entered if certain conditions are met, but the terms that the court is supposed to consider are not clear. Now, the reason I bring that up is because typically courts would look at legislative intent. And Mr. Posey talked about how they've had all these conversations about this legislation. But that's not legislative history. Those are conversations. If we had a hearing and got some of these things on the record, the court would be able to discern what the legislative intent was behind all of these provisions. And I firmly submit that if this direction is here to the court to enter summary judgment, these terms need to be much better defined and fleshed out. So I look forward to having further conversations about this. It's as I said, intriguing issue, but we should have hearings. We should specifically define the provisions. And we should have those on the record so that we have that legislative history to inform the policy that we're making. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. If there's no, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just like to set the record straight that this bill does not violate any of our international obligations. I can give you a long explanation for it, but we don't have time for that now. All the people that have raised questions about that issue have failed to ask me about that. During the past year, we have been working on this. All the people who are so offended that they just got a copy of the look at the last bill 5 weeks ago or 5 months ago have had this bill out there for over a year to look at, and they've not asked one time, made one inquiry. The obstructionists were able to find one witness to come in here and say it doesn't answer with absolute total certainty and no question every legal question I could ever ask. And in fact, I doubt that we have very many laws that do. But when there is ambiguity, I choose to fall or err on the side of America's interest. The U.S. Congress is elected to be America's voice and to look out for America's interest. And that's what we're trying to do with this legislation. Somebody from other parts of the world can probably go do this now without much interference from their government. That is really not our concern right now. The concern facing us is whether we want Americans to move forward and do this.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes, I will.
All right, thanks. I took the same oath of office that you did at the beginning of this year to uphold the Constitution. Will the gentleman please endeavor to explain how his bill meets the minimum context standard of the U.S. Constitution? I yield.
Well, you know, I would like to remind you that just a few minutes before you said you never believed the founders envisioned anything like the issue that we are addressing now. And so I cannot find space in the Constitution. There's a lot of things I can't find in the Constitution. I cannot find anywhere that this violates any portion of the Constitution, and that's what worries me the most. And so I think we're acting within our constitutional duties to do this. The obstructionists on the other side feel differently about that. We have come to expect that. I've come to expect that with some certainty, and I've done enough research to understand some of the reasons behind some of the objections that are not something I'd even want to discuss in public. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Opinion of chair, the noes have it, and a recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to committee rules, that vote will be rolled. We now go to two amendments by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, and I wonder if he might offer them in block because we hope to accept both.
Yes.
Okay, the gentleman is recognized for his amendments.
Thank you. With regard to the first amendment,
the clerk will report both amendments.
Amendment number 004 and amendment number 003 to H.R. 1508, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Without objection, the amendments will be considered as read, and the gentleman continues to be recognized.
Thanks. I continue to be concerned about the possibility that we're taking the constitutional right to regulate interstate commerce and expanding it to the right to regulate interplanetary commerce and perhaps one day intergalactic commerce. That being said, if we're going to have a bill like this, I think we should do it right. I've offered two essential drafting amendments that do not change the meaning of the bill in any respect, but clarify what I understand to be the fair intention of the bill. With regard to the first, the bill inadvertently leaves open the possibility that a mining company establishing operations on one asteroid, let's say Ceres, would be able to claim the right to full exclusive mining rights on every asteroid, Vesta and all the rest. I don't believe that that's what is intended. Certainly we should make these decisions one asteroid at a time, Pallas, Vesta, Ceres, whatever, and therefore I offered an amendment consistent with what I believe to be the intention of the bill to change the term asteroid resource to a resource found or within a single asteroid, one asteroid at a time. Secondly, I offer an amendment because, to be fair, the bill does refer to existing international obligations in several places. There was one place, the property rights section, where that was left out. I took that to be an inadvertent admission and therefore offered an amendment to make that section of the bill consistent with the other sections. I don't believe that either of these amendments would be controversial. If they are, I stand corrected. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I, like you, suggest that our colleagues support the amendments. I think they're improving amendments. And if there's no further discussion, the vote is on the two amendments en bloc offered by the gentleman from Florida. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And the ayes have it, and the amendments are agreed to. Pursuant to committee rules, we will postpone both the vote on the amendment in the nature of substitute and on final passage of the bill. And we will now go to consideration of H.R. 2261. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2261, the Commercial Remote Sensing Act of 2015. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2261, a bill to facilitate the continued development of the commercial remote sensing industry and protect national security.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Oklahoma, the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Bridenstine, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ability to image the Earth from space has revolutionized life on this planet. We can find better routes to where we are going. We can see when storms are coming, which is critical in Oklahoma. Our warfighters can know where the enemy is located. The implications of seeing the big picture are enormous and extend to nearly all aspects of the human experience in today's world. As the needs for remote sensing have grown over the decades, the responsibilities for providing this service have expanded to the private sector, and today we are seeing a boom in this industry. As the industry grows, we face two challenges: ensuring that our national security is never compromised and that capabilities are not hampered by a heavy Department of Commerce workload. Currently, the Department of Commerce, specifically NOAA, is tasked with regulating all private remote sensing space systems. Having one clearinghouse that permits or denies remote sensing activities is necessary to ensure that sensitive areas or classified activities are not imaged, putting our national security or the safety of our warfighters at risk. This is a vital function that we cannot do without. At the same time, in order for private companies and investors to have certainty, decisions must be made in a timely fashion. Current law requires action to be taken on applications within 120 days. We know the Department has in many cases missed this deadline, contributing to uncertainty among industry and in some cases delaying the fielding of capabilities critical to our economy and to national security missions. I say this not to cast aspersions on commerce or those who work there, but to highlight the importance of this bipartisan legislation. The Commercial Remote Sensing Act of 2015 sets metrics that will give Congress a full picture of the workload facing the Department and any issues that are preventing them from meeting the statutory deadlines. This will be especially crucial as industry expands beyond traditional remote sensing satellites and activities, and it is why the bill recognizes the importance of seeking input from the Advisory Committee for Commercial Remote Sensing, which is largely made up of industry representatives. Finally, this bill reiterates Congress's strong expectation that a proper balance be maintained so as not to compromise national security. This legislation is the first step in a longer process. It has been years since this issue was last addressed, and Congress will likely need to reevaluate statutes and funding levels for commercial remote sensing licensing going forward. But first, Congress must have the information necessary to make these decisions, and the Commercial Remote Sensing Act of 2015 will provide that information. I would like to thank my friend from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for his support of this bill and leadership on space issues, and also thank Chairman Smith, Congressman Posey, and Congressman Babin for their co-sponsorship. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. Appreciate your writing this legislation. I think we will go to the amendment offered by the gentleman. Okay. The gentleman from Colorado.
We're under the gun, so I thank my friend from Oklahoma for bringing this bill. It just requests a study as to why some of the permitting processes and the licensing activities are taking a substantial amount of time. We haven't updated these laws since the 90s, and there's a lot to say. It's a very important industry that's been developing, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill and ask for its passage.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Let me say that after we consider the gentleman from Florida's amendment, we will stand in recess until immediately after the last vote in this series of votes. We will come back, consider one bill, which should not take long, and then take up the roll votes from earlier amendments and bills. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you. May we have the amendment read?
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 001 to H.R. 2261, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida. On page 3, line 10, insert protect privacy, which is not to be taken as altering any condition or standards for licensing after protect national security.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you. I share Mr. Bridenstine's concern that modern technology can sometimes be a two-edged sword. At the same time as it gives us the bounty of all sorts of interesting apps and improves our lives and our ability to communicate, it can, on occasion, inadvertently or sometimes even advertently invade our privacy. With that in mind, I ask that the study that this bill contemplates include a section for having the administration examine the privacy issues raised by commercial remote sensing. To be clear, and I agree with the Congressman on this, I am not trying in any way to alter the standards at this point that are used to issue licenses, the licenses that are addressed by this bill. Simply looking for a well-thought-out, well-considered section of a report that deals with the issue of how these technologies, as they're evolving, may impair or even impact our privacy. That's the basis for our amendment. I ask for support of the amendment. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Florida and the gentleman from Oklahoma. Does he wish to comment on the amendment?
Yes, sir. I would like to do that, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to say, number one, I appreciate the gentleman from Florida for being willing to work with me on this language. and I appreciate his commitment to the Fourth Amendment and privacy issues, which I share. And certainly I really appreciate your willingness to work with me to get this language, I think, in a way that doesn't hinder the direction that we're trying to go and at the same time takes into account some of the concerns that we all share. So with that, I support this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I would encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Thank you, Mr. Bridenstine. All in favor of the Grayson Amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And opinion chair, the ayes have it, and the Grayson Amendment is approved. Pursuant to committee rules, we will postpone a vote on this bill, and with the agreement of the minority, we're going to try to finish up and get to the last bill, which we will do real quickly. I understand there are no amendments to it. So we will, pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2263, the Office of Space Commercial Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2263, a bill to rename the Office of Space Commerce and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read, and the gentleman from California, the sponsor of this legislation, is recognized.
We're just changing the name to be more reflective of what it's all about, and basically, anyway, that's what it is.
Okay. And are there any amendments to this bill? Does the gentleman have a technical correction or no technical correction? No amendments? Okay. All in favor of H.R. 2363 say aye. Opposed, nay. Can you share the ayes have it, and the bill is approved. Hold on. If there are no further amendments and a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2263 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. It was not amended. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2263 to the House. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 2263 is ordered reported to the House. Ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. We will reconvene. We'll stand in recess and reconvene immediately after the series of votes to take up the votes that were postponed. Thank the members for being here. The Science, Space, and Technology Committee will reconvene. We will now get to a series of postponed votes, and that first vote will be on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, and the clerk will call the roll. By the way, it is permissible for anyone with unanimous consent to withdraw a request for a recorded vote. Those who do so will be rewarded. The clerk will call the roll on Mr. Knight's amendment.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes yes. Mr. Lucas? Yes. Mr. Lucas votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes yes. Mr. Nagebauer? Mr. McCall? Aye. Mr. McCall votes yes. Mr. Plazo? Yes. Mr. Plazo votes yes. Mr. Brooks? Yes. Mr. Brooks votes yes. Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Holtgren votes yes. Mr. Posey? Yes. Mr. Posey votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? Yes. Mr. Bridenstine votes yes. Mr. Weber? Yes. Mr. Weber votes yes. Mr. Johnson? Yes. Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Molinar? Yes. Mr. Molinar votes yes. Mr. Knight? Yes. Mr. Knight votes yes. Mr. Babin? Mr. Westerman? Yes. Mr. Westerman votes yes. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes yes. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Loudermilk? Yes. Mr. Loudermilk votes yes. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes no. Mr. Babin. Yes. Mr. Babin votes yes.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? If not, the clerk will report the vote. We will suspend. Who wishes to be recognized? Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks. Oh, okay, he's voted. You want to vote again?
Mr. Chairman, 18 members voted aye, 12 members voted nay.
Okay, the amendment is adopted. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards. This is number 003. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith.
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas. No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Nagebauer. Mr. McCall. No. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Plazo. No. Mr. Plazo votes no. Mr. Brooks. No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren. No. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Bridenstine. No. Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Weber. No. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Molinar. No. Mr. Molinar votes no. Mr. Knight. No. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin. No. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Westerman. No. Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Comstock. Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Palmer. No. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes yes. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Mr. Lipinski. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes yes. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes yes. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Swalwell votes yes. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes yes. Ms. Esty. Ms. Esty votes yes. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes yes. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes yes. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes yes. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes yes.
And clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members voted aye, 18 members voted nay.
Amendment is not adopted. And question next is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and the clerk will call the roll. Oh, I skipped one, excuse me. Next up is an amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, number 006, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas? No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Nagebauer? Mr. McCall? No. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Plazo? Mr. Plazo votes no. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? No. Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar votes no. Mr. Knight? No. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin? No. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Westerman? No. Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? No. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? No. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Ms. Johnson? Aye. Ms. Johnson votes yes. Ms. Lofgren? Yes. Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Mr. Lipinski? Yes. Mr. Lipinski votes yes. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes yes. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes yes. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes yes. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes yes. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes yes. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes yes. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes yes. Mr. Byer? Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes yes. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes yes. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes yes. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes no.
And the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members voted yes, 19 members voted nay.
The amendment is not adopted. Question next is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko. The clerk will call the roll.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I misspoke. 18 members voted nay, 13 members voted aye.
Okay, amendment is not agreed to. And the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Nagebauer? Mr. McCall? No. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Plazo? Mr. Plazo votes no. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren? No. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? No. Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Weber? No. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Molinar? No. Mr. Molinar votes no. Mr. Knight? No. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes yes. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes yes. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes yes. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes yes. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes yes. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes yes. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes yes. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes yes. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes yes. Mr. Byer? Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes yes. Mr. Taco? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes yes. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members voted aye, 18 members voted nay.
Amendment is not adopted. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, as amended, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Yep. Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Nagebauer? Mr. McCall? Aye. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Plazo? Mr. Plazo votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 19 members have voted aye, 12 members have voted nay.
And the amendment is adopted. That concludes the votes on the amendments to H.R. 2262. I now move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2262 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2262 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably, and the record vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes yes. Mr. Lucas?
Yes.
Mr. Lucas votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Yes. Mr. Rohrabacher votes yes. Mr. Nagebauer? Mr. McCall? Aye. Mr. McCall votes yes. Mr. Plazo? Mr. Plazo votes yes. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes yes. Mr. Holtgren? Aye. Mr. Holtgren votes yes. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes yes. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes yes. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes yes. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar votes yes. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes yes. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes yes. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes yes. Ms. Comstock? Ms. Comstock votes yes. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes yes. Ms. Johnson?
No.
Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Clark? Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes no.
And the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 18 members voted aye, 13 members voted nay.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 2262 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. We will now go to an amendment to H.R. 1508 that was offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas? No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? No. Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. McCall? No. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Plazo? Mr. Plazo votes no. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren? No. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes no. Mr. Weber? No. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Molinar? No. Mr. Molinar votes no. Mr. Knight? No. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin? No. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Westerman? No. Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Ms. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Lipinski? Aye. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes aye. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members have voted aye, 18 members have voted nay.
The amendment is not adopted. I now move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 1508 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1508 to the House. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Plazo? No. Mr. Plazo votes aye. Mr. Brooks?
Oh, so say that.
Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Holtgren? Okay. Mr. Holtgren votes aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Bridenstine? Mr. Bridenstine votes aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar votes aye. Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Ms. Johnson? No. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Zesti? Ms. Zesti votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes no.
And Mr. Grayson?
No.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 18 members have voted aye, 15 members have voted nay.
The ayes have it, and H.R. 1508 is ordered reported favorably. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes without objection, so ordered. Do we have any amendments to this? I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2261 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2261 as amended. There's no amendments, right? As amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Who seeks to be recognized?
Alan Grayson.
Oh, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson.
I apologize for being unavoidably detained and missing the start of votes on these bills. I'd like to ask unanimous consent for the record to reflect that I would have voted as follows. With regard to the first vote, I would have opposed. With regard to the second vote, supported. With regard to the third vote, supported. With regard to the fourth vote, supported. With regard to the fifth vote, supported. And with regard to the sixth vote, supported.
Without objection, so ordered. Is there anyone else who wishes to be recognized? The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Unavoidably detained and missing the start of votes on these bills. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent for the record to reflect that I would have voted to vote no on amendment number 1, and yes on amendments number 3, 8, 9, and 12, and no on H.R. 2262.
Okay, without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Chairman, I wasn't going to do this, but since everyone else did, I ask unanimous consent if I could be recorded for votes. Amendment number 1 is a no, and number 3 as a yes.
Without objection, so ordered. That concludes our business. Once again, we've had great turnout today. I appreciate everybody's interest in the business of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and we stand adjourned.